pleading guilty? Because he never went to trial. Why is he pleading guilty if he doesn't have a cooperation agreement? And you talked about his attorney was all over the airwaves saying he's just doing it because he's a good guy. He's changed his mind on the president and he doesn't need a deal. But what's the thinking now?
Well, I am sure that Michael Cohen has a firm belief that the more he cooperated, the better his sentence would be, whether or not there was a cooperation agreement. Because even the court, without a cooperation agreement, would have to take into consideration that this is substantial. Let's remember this. The indictment that he pleaded guilty to this summer really does everything except name the president, Donald Trump. It does talk about, without a name, the person who was running for elected office, who instigated and directed his activities involving the campaign finance laws, which, since it wasn't Hillary Clinton, was clearly Donald Trump. So this is the only direct link. Michael Cohen is the only direct link in a court of law at this point to the president. Now, we apparently have a second direct link, and this one could be more worrisome. Because if, in fact, there was more to it than meets the eye of Donald Trump wanting to develop that Moscow project for a Trump hotel or a Trump tower, and then there may have been more conversations with the Russians prior to the election. We don't know that. It may be a rumor. It may be supposition. But Michael Cohen obviously is a very important witness to the government right now, particularly because they lost Paul Manafort.
This is, I think the question that people are going to have right now is I guess we're waiting for somebody to make a statement because I see there's a microphone that's set up. I don't know if Mr. Cohen is still inside the courthouse. Maybe that's the case. But the question that people are going to have is, what does this mean for the president? I think that's the million-dollar question here.
Of course.
What do you think it means?
Well, I don't know what it means, and that's why I say I was merely speculating. But you have to put yourself in the president's shoes. The president is really at his highest level of disgust about the special counsel's inquiry. He still is calling it a witch hunt and a hoax. He's very proud of those who did not flip, to use his term. He doesn't like flippers, to use his term. And so he's now cheering on Paul Manafort for being a good guy, for being, in essence, a double agent. While he's working for Robert Mueller, he's also, through his lawyer, working with the Trump defense team and the other lawyers. I will tell you, in all my years of practice in covering cases, I have never heard of someone who does this. I really haven't. Doesn't mean it hasn't ever happened. But, I mean, I have a pretty vast level of experience in these cooperative cases. I've never seen it before.
So here's I think, and one of the things, here comes Mr. Cohen. This is a live picture? No. Sorry. All right. Sometimes we do that video. We should put a date on there. So here's the question, Ricky. According to the Associated Press, this guilty plea is because he lied to Congress about some kind of a deal the president, or Trump, the Trump organization, had in pursuing a real estate project in Moscow.
Correct.
Why would you lie about that? Why would you lie to Congress about a deal?
I assume, this is the only thing I can assume, Vlad, and we're all dealing with here with the highest level of speculation because we really don't have facts. I assume that he would say that at that time that he testified before Congress, and frankly, I don't know what date that was in relation to his guilty plea, but back in the summer, but I assume it was before he pled guilty this summer, that when he testified before Congress, he is going to say that he was still Mr. Trump's lawyer and that he was protecting the president. I mean, what else can he possibly say? Well, we'll find out what else he can possibly say.
No, but I think that's a really good question, Vlad. I mean, you say to yourself, why do people lie, right? Do they lie to cover up a vulnerability, what they perceive as a vulnerability? So what's the vulnerability to the president or to Michael Cohen?
Well, we don't know. And the difficulty, we have always said in the legal business, the cover-up is always worse than the crime.
Right.
I mean, if you didn't get caught for the crime, you're going to get caught for the cover-up. So the idea of being put under oath before Congress and telling a deliberate lie is really foolish indeed, as if no one's ever going to find out. But we see it all the time. We see it before Congress. We see Paul Manafort lied to the special counsel. What in heaven's name was he thinking? We see it in cases all the time. Someone raises their right hand, swears an oath, and they lie in court.
We have eyes on Michael Cohen, I'm told. There he is. Let's try to listen.
Cooperated. Mr. Cohen will continue to cooperate. Sentencing is set for December 12th.
Mr. Cohen, how are you feeling? Mr. Cohen, how are you feeling?
Do you want to say anything? Thank you very much.
Are you happy? Mr. Cohen, why did you fight?
You can come out this way. Come out this way, Annie.
It's the worst thing I've ever seen.
As expected. Thank you.
What do you think's going to happen, huh?
What's down your window, Mr. Cohen?
Roll it down. Thank you, sir. All right, good luck.
Oh, you actually wrote it down? That's pretty for a new recipe.
I haven't seen a scrum like that around an investigation having to do with the office of the presidency, we believe, in ever. Where you see a media scrum like that of a witness who has just pled guilty to lying to Congress. And that witness you just saw there on your screen is the president's former personal attorney, Michael Cohen.
Well, no surprise there's a scrum. Can you imagine all of us here? It was just before we spoke about El Chapo earlier today, at sometime between 9:15 and 9:30, and we had the headline as breaking news. Every news outlet that is in New York is running toward that courthouse. And you can also keep in mind, bizarrely as it sounds, things happen when news outlets are available. Why did JonBenet Ramsey become such a famous case? The news outlets were in Denver because of the Timothy McVeigh terrorism case. You've got news outlets from all over the world in the Eastern District of New York. So if at some point they send somebody right over to the Southern District of New York, over the bridge from Brooklyn to Manhattan, plus New York is the news capital of the United States. So you are going to have everybody trying to find out, as we are trying to find out. We all want a copy of what he pled to and how precise it is. Now, when he pled guilty this summer, the prosecutors did quite a lengthy press conference. And it was setting it out in the most excruciating detail, which I have very rarely seen in a press conference. So are they going to do that again today? Well, we in our business would certainly like to see them do that again. But until we see precisely the charge, it could be very general. Remember, we don't know if this was a grand jury charge or if this was an information, capital I, where it's drafted by the prosecutor and then the defendant comes in and pleads just to that, which is usually not quite as detailed as a grand jury indictment. Though I will say Robert Mueller's capital I informations, if you look at the George Papadopolis one, was pretty detailed. Let
me just update our viewers that Speaker of the House, the outgoing Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, was just informed of Michael Cohen's plead of guilty for lying to Congress. And this is a quote. Speaker Ryan said, quote, he should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And he went on to say that this shows that Congress is doing its oversight job. This comes from our White House correspondent, Mark Mueller. That's sort of interesting as well.
I think it's not only interesting, I think it's correct. You know, it goes back to my tongue-in-cheek phrase, which perhaps is not appropriate to be funny here, because this is very serious. But, you know, you don't try to fool Mother Nature. You don't go into Congress. Congress. It's one of the three branches of government that runs this country. It's the legislative branch of government. You don't raise your right hand to God and then lie to Congress. This is very, very serious. The fact that he has admitted his lie, that he's cooperated with Robert Mueller, goes into his favorable column, no doubt about it. And I understand Paul Ryan's feeling that he should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. But if now you're admitting it and you're cooperating and you're giving information that helps the special counsel, you also get a reward for that, which, by the way, is also appropriate in how our criminal justice system works.
You know, as I'm watching this and I'm sort of going over in my head what these charges could be, what he pled guilty to, which is lying to Congress about this Russia deal, I was thinking, okay, so how do they know that he lied? They must have information from someone else to indicate otherwise.
Or he just simply told them.
You think he could have said, I lied?
He said, look, I'm cooperating with you now. I have to tell you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And I have to tell you that I took an oath.
Right.
Because I don't want to embarrass you later on. You know, it depends on how finessed he was, you know, or how he executed this. If they caught him in a lie by virtue of having other witnesses, then he's in much bigger trouble than if when he went in, he said, look, I'm laying myself bare to you. I'm going to tell you everything I've lied about, everything I've been truthful about. Right. Well, we don't know.
I recall now that the chief finance man for
Alan Weisselberg.
Right, he also testified in front of a grand jury. Do we know anything about his sort of, or I don't know if he did or he said to, but do we know anything about his part to this?
We do not. At least I do not at this point in time. Yeah. One of the things that we have all wondered about from the time of the summer plea of Michael Cohen is since Alan Weisselberg, the accountant for the Trump Organization, Trump Foundation, who knows where all the checks went and all the money went, and not only where it went, where the checks were drawn, but where was the money flowing out and flowing in, were they done with him back in the summer? Same thing, by the way, a little bit on the tawdry side, but it does count, is also the executives from the National Enquirer, American media. So David Pecker, when does it end? When doesn't it end? So was this all wrapped up in a nice little package with a bow in August? A lot of people said the cooperation was limited because their immunity, they got immunity, was limited. I have always felt that, well, I wouldn't be too sure about that. You know, you can't just put your right toe into cooperating with the government. You have to put both feet.
Let's just remind, I'm reading the research as we are reporting this news out to our viewers about Michael Cohen pleading guilty. The charge that he pled guilty to, which is lying to Congress, was tied to questions about real estate dealings that Donald Trump has had in Russia. And let's remember that Donald Trump, the Trump Organization, and the president before he became president, had extensive dealings with Russia going back to the 1980s and as recently as the late 2000s when he purchased the Miss USA pageant, one of the beauty pageants there.
Miss Universe.
Miss Universe.
And held it
Miss
there,
Universe, and held it there in Russia. This all culminated, and this is why we were sitting here talking about this and why this matters. This all culminated in that infamous meeting that Robert Mueller has been very interested in, that happened in June of 2016, where a Russian lawyer met with with Donald Trump's inner circle, including
Don Jr.
Don Jr., the president's son.
And by the way, Paul Manafort may or may not have had something to offer about that meeting in Trump Tower, and now Paul Manafort is gone.
Let's just introduce Caitlin Huey-Burns,
Always a pleasure to introduce
who's joining us here on set to talk about all of this. Caitlin,
we want to remind everybody, because it's the top of the hour, maybe you're just tuning in, we want to remind everybody what the breaking news is that we're covering, that Michael Cohen, the president's former attorney, more than an attorney, you know, he was sort of called a fixer, is to plead guilty to lying to Congress. He's expected to plead guilty to lying to Congress about, in fact, I don't know if we're confirming that he's already done that, but this is, okay, so he's already pled guilty. This is him leaving the courthouse with his attorney. He pled guilty to lying to Congress about Russian real estate deals in Russia, to essentially downplaying the real estate deals in Russia. There's not a lot of sound here. It's his attorney says to the crowd of reporters that he is cooperating and will continue to cooperate. He's pled guilty before, earlier in the summer, to campaign finance violations. That's in the Southern District. This plea is in connection with the Mueller investigation.
Paula Reed is standing by right now at the White House. Paula, what are your sources telling you about this?
Oh, that's right. As Anne-Marie noted, Cohen pleaded guilty over the summer to several offenses related to campaign finance violations. And as part of that plea deal, he had to cooperate with the special counsel. Today, he enters this new surprise plea deal with the special counsel where he has admitted to making false statements to Congress. This is a significant development. And over the past several days, we have seen the special counsel once again making moves and making headlines after months of relative silence. And none of this is sitting well with the president. He has ramped up his attacks against the investigation. You're looking at a man who seems emboldened by his larger majority in the Senate. He is a new, seemingly loyal acting Attorney General Matthew Whitaker, and the president seems to again be launching these more aggressive attacks against the special counsel as the special counsel continues to move forward and arguably continue to move closer to the president.
You know, Paula, so the question that we've been asking Ricky here, and the question I'll pose to you is, A, are you hearing, first of all, any reaction from the White House, number one, because we know the president is set to depart in just moments for Argentina. Hopefully he'll be generous with his time as he has been and offer up some notes to the press. But also, sort of, what does this mean for the president going forward?
Well, first of all, I can still hear the helicopters. I'm on the north lawn of the White House. He's departing on the south lawn. I don't think he has left yet. We have a reporter. Our colleague, Weijia Jiang, is back there to toss some questions at him. It's unclear whether or not he will stop. You just never know. Sometimes you think he will, he won't. But we have not heard anything from the White House. That will be our first opportunity to hear his reaction. Now, what does this mean for the president? Well, if he made false statements about the extent to which he was talking to the president about this Trump Tower Moscow deal,
Paula, sorry, we had to interrupt you for just 1 second because Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana is speaking.
Well, yeah, it's occurred to me. You know, the reason that people can get away with it is they're not prosecuted. Same thing with leaks. I can tell you one of the reasons. I'm not saying it's a good reason or a bad reason, but one of the reasons I believe that the CIA chief didn't come visit with us yesterday in our classified briefing is because they're worried about leaks. And the way to stop that is not to come testify. It's to come talk. It's classified. And if somebody leaks it, including but not limited to a senator, there are ways to find out. You chase them down like a hound from hell, and you prosecute them to the full extent of the law. And all you got to do is do that one time, and it'll stop.
So does this send an important message then to anyone else?
Well, I mean, I think it does. It does. Look, you know, rule of law is one of our shared values in America. When you break the law, you ought to be prosecuted.
And, Senator, you heard the president yesterday say he's not taking off the table the possibility of a pardon for Paul Manafort. Mm-hmm. Does that concern you?
I don't know. I don't know what the president's thinking is on that. I'll tell you what concerns me right now, my biggest concern in terms of the Mueller investigation. Let's get it all wrapped up. And it looks to me like there's some movement in terms of, I don't want to tell Mr. Mueller how to do his job. He doesn't need my counsel on that. He seems quite able. But we do need to wrap it up. It's been, 17 months now, and the American people are entitled to know what happened and who, if anybody, broke the law. I hope this report is made public. I hope they don't try to pull one of these, if we showed it to you, we'd have to kill you thing. American people have a right to know, and they'll figure it out. Okay, I know everybody's spinning them about this stuff, but part of the problem in Washington, there are a lot of smart people in Washington D.C., but many of them, not you guys, of course, but many of them think they're just so much smarter than the American people, and the American people need to be spun. If we give the American people the facts, they'll figure this out and draw their own conclusions.
Will Congress demand for the report to be made public? Will you be able to push in any way for that report?
Well, I mean, yes, I feel very strongly about it. I'm not suggesting that there's any indication that they won't make it public. I just haven't heard a lot of talk about it. And, I felt very strongly that the FBI report with respect to the Kavanaugh nomination should have been made public. Do you mind if I say something about this, the Yemen and the Khashoggi issue?
Go for it.
If the Senate has has a plan.
All right, so you've been listening to Senator John Kennedy essentially reiterating what we heard earlier from our Mark Mueller, who covers the White House, from House Speaker Paul Ryan, which is that because Mr. Cohen has pled guilty to lying to Congress, he should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. I think the senator used a little bit more colorful language there. Let's go back to Paula Reed, who's at the White House. Paula, you just heard from another member of Congress with regards to this. And of course, the flip side of that is Senator Kennedy saying, now that we're starting to see some more movement on this, the special counsel should wrap it up.
We've been hearing that for a long time, especially from the president's attorneys. The fact is that the special counsel is pursuing the facts. They are charging people entering mostly into plea deals or holding trials, depending on the evidence they uncover. And what you never know in an investigation like this is once you start turning over rocks, what you will discover. There are signs that perhaps we're getting near the end, but the fact is we don't know. Mueller is a man full of secrets and surprises. He's always like 10,000 steps ahead of us. Even today's plea deal, for example, was a surprise. What we do know in terms of how much longer this will take, we know the special counsel continues to call witnesses before the grand jury. That suggests that they will likely charge additional people. We also know they're in the process of negotiating more plea deals. We know that Jerome Corsi, he is in the process of possibly negotiating a plea deal. So at this point, it does not appear the special counsel's investigation is going to wrap up anytime soon, certainly not in the next month or so.
So, Paula, as we understand it, this is based on information, false information that he gave to Congress. That would have been sort of a closed-door Q&A session with Congress. Does this mean that the Mueller investigators are looking through all of this stuff? They're keeping track of what people are saying in Congress? To Congress,
absolutely.
Rather?
Absolutely. That's a great roadmap for them, too. When they sit down to interview someone, they have a whole transcript of their answers that they gave before Congress. They can then try to test those, both lying to Congress or lying to federal investigators. That's a crime if you lie to either one of those parties. It appears that most of the committees are cooperating with the special counsel. So, yeah, that's how they would know that he lied. But they likely have other evidence, which is what brought this lie to light, unless he gave the special counsel a different story than what he gave Congress.
So, Paula, Ricky was talking to us a little bit about this charge of lying to Congress. It sort of boggles the mind that, you know, you would, as a lawyer, Michael Cohen's a lawyer, sit before the legislative body, the legislative branch of this country, raise your right hand, as Ricky said, and then proceed to lie. I mean, it's sort of, I know that when prosecutors are looking to make deals, you're essentially making deals with people who have lied and who have done terrible things. Is that what we're kind of looking at here?
Look, I've covered the Justice Department for several years now, and I continue to be surprised. Very smart, very accomplished people. They lie to the federal government. General Petraeus, Martha Stewart, many people lie. So it doesn't actually surprise me anymore. But a common theme in this investigation, the way they've gotten people, isn't necessarily on any conspiracy with Russia. It's been on lying. That's been a common theme for Paul Manafort. He's been convicted of lying. Michael Cohen has pleaded guilty to lying. So the fact that he also told lies to Congress, to be honest, it does not surprise me very much at all.
So, you know, when talking about Manafort, and I think a reporter asked Senator Kennedy about this, you know, the president has said a pardon's not off the table. I mean, I know that his relationship with Michael Cohen is pretty much garbage right now, but
well, but it's actually, let me ask this, Anne-Marie, because you raise a really interesting point. He's willing to pardon, at least it's not off the table when it comes to Paul Manafort, who, if you listen to the president, he barely knew, right? Yeah. Paul Manafort worked with Reagan. He only came with us for a little while. Meanwhile, Michael Cohen volunteered, exactly. Michael Cohen's been with the president for years, a number of years. Why is the ability to pardon Paul Manafort not off the table, and it's not the same case for Mr. Cohen, supposedly his loyal fixer?
Well, I believe the president was specifically asked about a possible pardon for Paul Manafort because he had just been accused of violating a plea deal. He's looking at spending the rest of his life in prison. Michael Cohen is not necessarily going to spend the rest of his life in prison, depending on how all of this shakes out. It may only be a few years once you add up all the charges. But Michael Cohen made a deliberate decision several months ago. He decided to make a clean break from the president, and he was very public about it. He said he was loyal to his family and his country, and he was no longer loyal to the president. There is nothing, though, preventing the president from pardoning everyone who's pleaded guilty or been convicted in the special counsel if he wanted to send a message about that investigation. So right now, it would seem very unlikely that Mr. Cohen would get a plea deal, but he's in a different situation than Paul Manafort. He's looking at the rest of his life in jail. So far, has not successfully cooperated with the special counsel and is coordinating with the president's attorneys. All signs point to the fact that Manafort is angling for a pardon, which is why the president was asked specifically about Manafort.
Okay, is Paul going to be able to stay with us? I'm not sure if Paul is staying with us. If you could, okay, so we have a full panel here, right? We have Ricky Kleeman also here with us. So listen, guys, I want to ask you, because I keep thinking, okay, so what's in it for Mueller? Is it just enough to get this guilty plea from Cohen, or is this one step in another step? Do you get what I'm saying? Could this be part of a bigger puzzle here? Are there further charges coming?
There certainly will be further charges coming, but only if this leads us to something else. I mean, it may simply be all about Michael Cohen, that there was a project. We know there was a real estate project in Russia. We know that. He lied about it to Congress. We don't know to what extent. But does it really become material to any investigation and prosecution? Well, I'll say any investigation and finding in Robert Mueller's report against the President of the United States? Or does it lead to a prosecution of other people if it gets us back to the Trump Tower meeting? We don't know. This may stand all in and of itself. Yeah. One of the things that has been passed to us as we have been standing here, because it's a work in progress, is the fact that it looks like now, according to the press, doesn't mean, it's always preliminary. The first story is not always the last story, but that it was Mueller's office that found out or put together that there had been a lie. And that's how did they find it out? It sounds like from press reports. So we're kind of in a little bit of a circle here. And that's not good for Michael Cohen either, because he was supposed to go in. He wanted to go in. He worked with the special counsel's office. And then does the special counsel have to recently go find him?
Sorry,
that's
Ricky.
a problem.
Senator Mark Warner is speaking. Let's listen.
It's already in the public domain that referrals have been made from our committee to the special prosecutor, but we're not going to talk about any individuals.
Did you still think, does this make Michael Cohen a less reliable witness for Bob Mueller, that he admitted that he lied to your committee?
Well, there seems to be a trend here amongst so many of the president's closest allies that they don't tell the truth, although you've also got a White House that seems on a daily basis not to have its facts straight.
Would this extend your investigation at all?
Well, we still have a number of witnesses to see, and we have a number of witnesses that are some of the key names, key individuals, that the chairman and I are working through on how we get them to come back. Because just as our investigation has to finish, and we owe the American public as much of the truth as we've been able to discover, it also is just one more reinforcing indication why the Mueller investigation has to be allowed to continue unimpeded. And I just don't believe that the current acting attorney general, Mr. Whitaker, has the temperament and also the bias to oversee that investigation. And one of the things we don't know, for example, is we've not been able to hear back from the Justice Department whether Whitaker has ever received an ethics review of whether he should recuse himself from that investigation.
But does this new information learned from Michael Cohen, does that factor into the people that you will call, and will you call some people again knowing this new information?
Well, again, I'm not going to get into the witnesses of who we've called, who we continue to intend to call, but as we continue to see this rollout of close Trump allies plead guilty, almost always due to their trying to hide their ties with Russia and Russians, and the Russians' attempt to infiltrate the Trump campaign. I think there's more story to be told.
If Mueller knows or was able to prove that Cohen lied to your committee, what does that tell you about how much more he knows or where that investigation is right now?
Well, again, I think it seems like it was ages ago, but it was only in August when Mr. Cohen decided to work with the special prosecutor. My understanding, some level of working together. And I think we've all felt that Michael Cohen has a lot of information that I hope he shares with the special prosecutor, and one of the reasons why we think he needs to come back and share it more with the Senate Intelligence Committee.
In his hearing just now, Cohen said that he made these false statements to be consistent with individual one's messaging, individual one presumably being the president. What does this tell you about the president?
Well, I've not read. I just got the headlines from Rachel about what he said. But let's face it, you've got all these close associates of the president, one after another, pleading guilty, often pleading guilty about their ties to Russia and Russians. And what are they covering up for? And we also have a White House that still seems just obsessed about this investigation. If anything the president has said is true, that there's no there, why are all his closest associates being found guilty of lying about their ties to Russia?
And the president has said that he's...
It was in the context of Paul Manafort yesterday. It was in the context of Paul Manafort yesterday, but the president is still talking about leaving pardons on the table. He hasn't ruled a pardon out for Paul Manafort. He hasn't been asked yet, to my knowledge, about Cohen. But how much does that concern you, that the issue of pardons is just being openly discussed at the White House, potentially?
That would be a complete abuse of power. The power of the pardon is not ever been used to protect a president and his family. And again, we've seen from this White House again and again disregard for rule of law. When we see that disregard for rule of law, and if he were to go out and try to pardon some of these individuals that might potentially implicate him or his family, again, Congress would have to act.
Thank you all.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, sir.
Did you all return this?
I think somebody already asked that.
All right, so bit by bit, we're hearing from lawmakers as they react to the news that Michael Cohen has pleaded guilty to lying to Congress, lying in front of a congressional committee. Caitlin Huey-Burns, I did not introduce you the last time we were up, so I want to let everyone know that you're here. And you brought up something very interesting to remind everybody. The president is heading to the G20 summit in Argentina, and he's scheduled to meet with Vladimir Putin.
Exactly, and that comes, of course, against the backdrop of Russian aggression in Ukraine again. And there was going to be the spotlight on the president asking what kind of pressure he would put on Russia, if any at all. So again, we're circling back to this conversation about Trump and Russia. With this news coming out, I think that will place a bigger spotlight on what the president plans to do or say to Putin or in public about this. The second thing to consider is that we have had senators on Capitol Hill pushing for legislation to protect the Mueller probe, but it's been blocked by Republicans. So that legislation is still not there. And we also have to consider that just a few weeks ago, we had a midterm election in which the House is going to change power over to Democrats. So in about 6 or 7 weeks or so, you're going to have a lot of these House Democratic players that we've seen really involved in the Russia investigation now have subpoena power. And so what does that mean for this investigation, but also for the president's own finances and what they can try to extract from the president on the legislative front?
So when you see this now overly, seems like now, right, what we're dealing with is an issue with the president's real estate business. Now it's overlapping into the Mueller investigation. That was a red line for the president, but if it overlaps into the Mueller investigation legitimately, then why not ask for the taxes, right?
That is the question that I have, you guys. It's because of this, because Michael Cohen has been caught lying, can Robert Mueller sit back and say, you know, we first started this, here were the parameters of what we were given to investigate, but because we've uncovered this lying and this sort of backdealing, we are going to ask for a lot more than what we originally intended the scope of this investigation to be. Can they start looking at his taxes? Can they go to Michael Cohen and say, let's talk about the deals that President Trump had back in the 90s when you were under his employ? Can they go that wide?
Well, let's look at who is now the Attorney General. See, you had Rod Rosenstein, who was handling this investigation from the Attorney General's office once Jeff Sessions recused himself. So Robert Mueller could go to Rod Rosenstein and say, I need to go here. I mean, I can't not go here. It's one of the motions that happened during the Paul Manafort case. Manafort's lawyers in the Eastern District of Virginia tried as hard as they could to get the case dismissed on the basis that the Paul Manafort dealings were all long before the campaign, and they lost that motion. The case went forward. Here, now Robert Mueller would have to go, if he wanted to go farther than he already has gone, he has to go to Matthew Whitaker.
And of course, given the acting Attorney General's pronouncements on cable news, there's a good sense. We have a good idea of how he might approach that.
But you also have this. Robert Mueller, it sounds like, and as I'm quickly trying to read this information, capital I, which are the charges against Michael Cohen, it sounds like this is very recent. So if I look at the last date, that would probably help me out. This was put together on August, no, I'll tell you in a minute.
These were 2016, 2017.
Events.
In terms of time frame, yeah.
Yes, but in terms of when was this information actually charged? Is it charged under Whitaker? Did he approve it? Or was this something that was already charged under Rosenstein?
Right, that is interesting.
And then they decided to go forward with it.
Do we have a date on that?
I don't know. We'll have to prove this very quickly.
Maybe one of our producers can do some digging and check this.
I don't have the service date or the final date. I only have the charges.
Because that would really be kind of interesting. Because
well, it would be interesting if it's under Whitaker.
Yeah.
But, you know, Robert Mueller is no fool. I still have my own speculation that Robert Mueller may have, purely speculation, filed sealed indictments while Rod Rosenstein was still here.
In case Whitaker decided to shut it down.
Well, just in case, this before Whitaker gets appointed, because it was like overnight. But there was rumors, not even rumors, it was talked about everywhere, that as soon as the midterms happened, Jeff Sessions was gone. So if you were Robert Mueller, wouldn't you, under Rod Rosenstein, try to file some sealed indictments before the midterm election?
Yeah, he's been, the president has been very publicly attacking Rod Rosenstein as well. So
right.
Yeah.
So
he had a photo of him behind bars yesterday with the word treason.
Yeah. So. Well, along with all the others
all the
in that.
Former presidents and Hillary Clinton and a lot of other
and
people.
Robert Mueller.
Yeah.
So the smart thing would have been for Robert Mueller to have done that. I have no basis in fact for saying it, but I do know Robert Mueller for many decades, and there is nothing lost on him.
And as we've seen through this investigation, the way in which there have been no leaks of anything. And to Paula's point, that just goes to show how much we question what we don't know yet, what Robert Mueller has, to your point about how he has already been laying the groundwork for this. Yeah. And, you know, it's also interesting to consider the really frayed relationship between Cohen and the president, and why the president has been tweeting just this morning, calling this a witch hunt, calling this a partisan exercise. We have seen in public polling that has had a corrosive effect in terms of the way in which the president has been talking about this investigation. Cohen, of course, was so incredibly close to the president, not only, a confidant and a friend, but also, of course, dealing with all of these financial transactions that are, of course, kind of seeming to be at the center of this investigation. We should also note that as much as the president calls this an illegal witch hunt, it's not. Everything has been done legally, authorized, of course. And we've also seen indictments come out from the Mueller probe as it relates to Russian interference in the election that the White House has acted upon in terms of issuing sanctions against Russia. So, as much as the president demeans this investigation, we have seen the White House act upon it, and we are starting to see the effects of this inner circle cooperating with the Mueller probe. I should note, because a lot of these actors have lied to investigators.
So I have a question, and it goes to what Speaker Ryan said, which is it shows that the congressional oversight is working. How does Michael Cohen lying to Congress land on the desk of the special counsel? In other words, who is it? Just he delivered this testimony, Congress shares the testimony with the special prosecutor or special counsel, and then based on what they uncover, they're the ones to bring charges. This is sort of a legal, but my mind is trying to figure out how it lands on his desk if it happened to Congress.
Well, I assume that and Paula may have the answer for this. I assume that, as Paula has mentioned in the past, there is a lot of sharing going on between these committees in the Congress about testimony with the Office of the Special Counsel. I don't know if they're sharing from the Special Counsel back to Congress, but nonetheless, they are all working toward the same goal, which is to find out what the truth is, for better or for worse.
I just want to ask our producers, I'm going to ask you guys directly, the information that we got from our Nancy Cordes, that's reportable? I don't know if they're talking to her.
Yeah, while they dig into
because
that,
look into that because there's an indication that there's something that might answer your question.
Right.
Yeah.
So this infamous Russia meeting that happened in Trump Tower in June of 2016, we did learn, and CBS News did confirm, that the president answered with regards to that meeting to a question from the special counsel that he was not involved in the decision.
Knew nothing
about it, but there was a legalese.
To the best of his recollection.
Right, which is the gray area that allows you to say, yeah, I don't remember if I did
because
that.
it's not about telling.
Suddenly I do remember.
Because it's not about telling a mistruth, if you will, or it's about deliberately lying. And so if you can't remember.
Yes, well, we've seen witnesses.
But you're a lawyer. You tell a client to do that. Why?
Well, many lawyers would tell clients to do that because in case they really forgot something and that later on something does refresh their recollection that they hadn't thought of before. Well, that would be the ethical way of handling this. At the same time, I know President Trump has been quite vocal about saying that he drafted all of these answers by himself, not on the part of his lawyers. I find that very difficult to believe when you see the language, to the best of my recollection. But he's also no fool. He knows that people get caught in lies. They get caught in lies to federal agents, which is how people like Martha Stewart got prosecuted. People like George Papadopolis got prosecuted. And lying to a federal agent is a crime that falls under the Statute 1001. So we always call it a 1001 crime. And that's one thing. To think that you could pull the wool over some agent's eyes in a closed room. I do think that when you go into a grand jury, you ought to have your wits about you and tell the truth. But that's why I'm still amazed that people like Michael Cohen could go into Congress and think that they could bulldoze their way through Congress. This type of stuff, he wrote a 2-page letter and he testified before Congress consistent with that letter. And now, apparently, he was fibbing about a lot of things about Mr. Trump, then Mr. Trump's interest in a Moscow project.
This is what our Nancy Cordes has sort of dug up, right? And she reminds us that in August, the chair and vice chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee announced that they had re-engaged with Michael Cohen after press reports contradicted his testimony about the Trump Tower meeting. We talk about all this investigating, and it's something as sort of pedestrian as they were watching or reading something in the press and said, hey, he didn't say that. So what we can say is that we recently re-engaged with Mr. Cohen and his team following press reports that suggested he had advanced knowledge of the June 2016 meeting between campaign officials and Russian lawyers at the Trump Tower. That meeting keeps coming back over and over again. Mr. Cohen had testified before the committee that he was not aware of the meeting prior to its disclosure in the press last summer. As such, the committee inquired of Mr. Cohen's legal team as to whether or not Mr. Cohen stood by his testimony, and he responded that he did stand by his testimony. So he would have known that something was up, and he said that so that perhaps is what opened up not just his testimony about the Trump Tower, but his testimony about a lot of other things, including this Russia real estate deal.
And let's just remember that originally the purpose, according to the president's inner circle of that meeting, was to discuss about adoption.
Right.
And then when it came to light, because of the dogged reporting of journalists, that it was indeed not about Russia, the president tweeted this in August of 2018. Fake news reporting a complete fabrication that I'm concerned about the meeting my wonderful son Donald had in Trump Tower. This was a meeting to get information on an opponent. Totally legal and done all the time in politics, and it went nowhere. At least in this tweet, he says, I did not know about it.
Right. But a tweet is not a comment under oath. Yeah. It is not a comment to a federal agent. So tweeting or misleading the public, as President Trump, we know, has often done in the cases of Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal. So why should this be any different? He has misled the public intentionally about a lot of things that are very difficult for him. And then suddenly the truth morphs, and it morphs again, and it morphs one more time. And Rudy Giuliani is dragged out on TV to explain why now this is the truth and why the other ones were what I would call puffing. President Trump also has to look at the fact that one of the things that we may forget about is that there is the thought, I don't know if it can be proven, that he dictated Donald Trump Jr.'s statement that was given about his activities. So that may be something that Robert Mueller may have never let go of.
That's very true. We should remind everyone
what we're
talking about right here. If you're joining us now, we're following a developing situation in New York where President Trump's former lawyer, Michael Cohen, has pleaded guilty to lying to Congress. Here he is earlier leaving the courthouse in New York City. He admitted to making false statements last year related to a plan to build a Trump Tower in Moscow.
All right, back in August, you'll recall, Michael Cohen also pleaded guilty to other federal charges involving his taxi business, bank fraud, and his campaign work for then-candidate Trump, with, of course, porn star Stormy Daniels, Karen McDougal, arranging payments. There's a lot. There's so much to unravel here, and you're looking at a live shot right now of the White House because the President of the United States is getting ready to depart for a very important summit, the G20, happening in Buenos Aires. We do have a team there that's on the lawn of the White House that will take questions when the president does approach reporters, as he's sometimes apt to do. Before we do that, let's bring in Pat Milton. She's a senior investigative producer here at CBS News. Pat, what are you learning?
Yes, well, it was a surprise appearance for Michael Cohen to plead guilty in U.S. District Court in Manhattan. He pled, to one count to a criminal information about making a false statement to Congress regarding the work he did on the Trump real estate project in Russia. We know that there were 3 prosecutors working for Special Counsel Robert Mueller investigation who were present in the courtroom at the time of his plea. We know that Cohen has been cooperating with the Mueller probe.
Was there any other information revealed during his appearance in court, or was it sort of pretty brief?
Yes, that is correct. It was a brief proceeding. The courtroom was packed. He entered the plea, and he's described as being very straightforward and speaking matter-of-factly when he entered his plea to the judge. We know, in August that he pled guilty to federal charges stemming from, in part, his campaign work for Trump. And he's scheduled in that particular plea from August to be sentenced December 12th. It's unclear whether this particular plea will also have a sentence date of the same, whether they're going to merge it into December 12th. And that would be before Judge William Pauley in federal court in Manhattan.
Judge William Pauley?
Yes.
All right.
Pat, what about his attorney? We can see members of the media trying to throw questions at Michael Cohen. His attorney's talking. Does his attorney have anything to say?
Not that we know. He did make reference to the fact that this is all part of his cooperation with the Mueller probe.
Pat, we so appreciate you calling in. I know you're working your sources here. It would be interesting to know if you do learn whether or not Mr. Cohen's plea, his sentencing rather, will be merged with the latest guilty plea here, or if there will be a separate one. We'd be interested in knowing that.
Right.
Thank you.
I think that there is discussions with the court authorities and with the prosecutor and the defense to see whether they will be merged.
All right. Our senior investigative producer, Pat Milton, always great to have you. Thank you so much for your information. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
I think it's kind of interesting that, when Cohen's attorneys were asked earlier about his cooperation with the Mueller probe, his attorney said it was in exchange for nothing, that he was cooperating because he's essentially a good American citizen. Now it looks like this guilty plea is connected to that cooperation. So I wonder, Nancy Cortez says that lying to Congress, you could get 5 years for that. I wonder if maybe there has been some agreement in terms of sentencing to sort of be lighter on him,
And we are getting word from our White House producers that the president did speak to reporters on his way to depart for Joint Base Andrews and then on to Argentina for that G20 summit. And he is doing kind of as we expected, calling Cohen apparently a weak person, saying that the president claiming that Cohen is lying, also saying that he did nothing wrong and that Cohen is trying to get a sentence reduced for other things unrelated, he says, to this probe. And remember, that is the kind of language we've heard over and over again from the president as it relates to Cohen and as it relates to pretty much most of these actors involved in this who have pleaded guilty to lying to investigators.
And what we asked Ricky earlier, Paula Reed confirming that this is reportable that Mr. Cohen's cooperation with the special counsel is not done. It will continue. This plea is not the end of the arrangement that Michael Cohen has with the special counsel.
No, because this plea to facts that there's lying about a project in real estate involving the Trump organization with an information, capital I, that's the charges, that talk about an individual 1 and an individual 2.
What does that mean?
They are not named. There is a policy in the Department of Justice, which is why in the August plea, when you had Michael Cohen pleading to the campaign finance violations, that he was directed by, I don't remember if the word was individual 1 or cooperating witness 1 or candidate 1, whatever the witness was. There is a policy in the Department of Justice that they do not name in their paperwork the unindicted co-conspirator by name. And so here we have individual 1 and individual 2. Well, as I get to peruse this further, I will bet that one of those individuals may be the President of the United States. Wow. But I've got to read. So I'm trying to read while I'm listening and I'm talking. But the difficulty here is this sounds like this all just came about. That from the information that our correspondent Nancy Cordes got, that this was confirmed, brought to the attention of the special counsel by virtue of press reports, and you had the testimony from the Congressional Committee earlier on. So it sounds like this came together rather recently. Oh, no, Michael Cohen is clearly not done. Whether or not he will be sentenced on December 12th or at a later date is still up for grabs. December 12th is pretty soon. And you know what happens, which is often what has happened with Rick Gates. Rick Gates, we may recall, is the person who was right under Paul Manafort in their business. Gates was the cooperator against Manafort. Rick Gates' sentencing has been put over numerous times with the Department of Justice through the special counsel filing a motion that says that we need more time because, in essence, his cooperation is not complete. And we don't want him sentenced until we are ready to say he is complete. You never want someone sentenced, if you can help it, until they've actually testified if there is a trial. But in this case, you know, it may just be that they want to firm up the entire thing. For heaven's sake, today, now that I think of it, is November 29th. Originally, it was thought that Mike Flynn was going to be sentenced on or about November 28th. Right. Well, obviously, that hasn't happened.
Yeah, and so to me, a lot of what we're talking about, Caitlin, suggests that come January, when the Democrats take control of the House of Representatives, that this is going to get, I mean, the scope of what we're talking about is going to widen, because we're going to see a lot of public hearings, a lot of people that are going to be compelled to come up to the Hill and sit before Congress.
And remember, the president had been kind of warning against this while he was campaigning for Republicans.
Presidential harassment,
over exactly, and saying if you let Democrats take over, they will try to impeach me and kind of move forward with more investigations. And he has been very concerned about that in public. Now, you're going to have House members who have now been in the minority, now in the majority on these relevant committees, also given this power of subpoena to not only continue this Russia investigation, but also to dive deeper and deeper into the president's own financial dealings, about which there has been virtually no transparency. And that has been a real concern that we've heard from Democrats, that there hasn't been adequate oversight of this president. And so this will certainly, as we don't know how long the Mueller investigation goes, you can certainly bet that House investigators at least will want to broaden this out.
I just think, and this is just speculation, but, you know, a lot of members of Congress, Democrats, of course, have said that they want to see the president's tax returns. The president was recently asked about it in just the last couple of weeks. He was asked about it again during an interview, and he said, well, he's under audit. He gave the standard response that he's given over and over and over again. It might have actually been at a press conference that he said that, you know, he's under audit right now. The fact that the president, for now 3 years plus, has been unwilling to share the details of his tax returns is compelling.
It's always been compelling, especially since we just don't know what we've known about other presidents than we do about this one. And we also, again, have the issue of all of these members of either the inner orbit of the Trump organization and Trump's campaign team, or even those on the periphery, most of them lying to investigators, which of course brings up the question of why. And you can take that all the way back to, you know, the beginning of this presidency and Michael Flynn, you know, not telling the truth about those meetings. So, you know, it will be, my question is, as it is with any time we get news about anything related to the Mueller probe, is what this prompts the president to do. Now that question is takes on greater significance because he has already fired Jeff Sessions. And I mean, I'm interested in your thoughts about what this means versus, you know, the Southern District of New York and what's done there versus what the president can actually do or try to do and what he can't do.
Let's just point out to the viewers that we may cut you off, Ricky, in your response to Caitlin's question because we received the 2-minute warning for the president who's going to be speaking. So, but I just want to give you.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. I'm good at shutting up. You know, the rap in my ear is always what I know. The Southern District of New York, just like every other U.S. attorney's office in the country, is still under the aegis of the Department of Justice. So they will follow the rules that come out of the Department of Justice. However, once a case has been charged and someone has gone into court and pleaded guilty, then that is not going away. That plea is not going away. A future charge, perhaps under Matthew Whitaker as the acting attorney general, that Mueller might want, may not be filed because whether it's in the Southern District, the Eastern District, or Washington, that's it.
Here is the president. Let's listen.
Michael Cohen has made many statements to the House, as I understand it, and the Senate. He put out a statement talking about a project which was essentially, I guess, more or less of an option that we were looking at in Moscow. Everybody knew about it. It was written about in newspapers. It was a well-known project. It was during the early part of 16, and I guess even before that. It lasted a short period of time. I didn't do the project. I decided not to do the project, so I didn't do it. So we're not talking about doing a project. We're talking about not doing a project. Michael Cohen, what he's doing is he was convicted, I guess. You'll have to put it into legal terms. But he was convicted with a fairly long-term sentence on things totally unrelated to the Trump organization, having to do with mortgages and having to do with cheating the IRS, perhaps, a lot of different things. I don't know exactly, but he was convicted of various things unrelated to us. He was given a fairly long jail sentence, and he's a weak person. And by being weak, unlike other people that you watch, he's a weak person, and what he's trying to do is get a reduced sentence. So he's lying about a project that everybody knew about. I mean, we were very open with it. We were thinking about building a building. I guess we had in a form, it was an option. I don't know what you'd call it. I decided ultimately not to do it. There would have been nothing wrong if I did do it. If I did do it, there would have been nothing wrong. That was my business. So he's lying very simply to get a reduced sentence, okay? During the period I run for president, that doesn't mean I'm not allowed to do business. I was doing a lot of different things when I was running. After I won, obviously, I don't do business from January 20th, but more importantly, which is a following year. But I ran a business. In fact, I often joke about the fact that I was the only person that campaigned and simultaneously ran a business. But that was a project that we didn't do. I didn't do. That was a project that wasn't done for a lot of reasons. Number one is that I was really, not that I had to do it, but I was focused on running for president. I wanted that to be my primary focus, not running or building a building. Well, this was a deal that didn't happen. That was no deal. I mean, if you look, this was an option. I guess, I don't know if I want to be very specific. So, but to my way of thinking, it was an option that I decided not to do. So we didn't. So if you look, we really didn't have, excuse me. So, excuse me. This was an option in a form, but here's very simple. We had a position to possibly do a deal to build a building of some kind in Moscow. I decided not to do it. The primary reason, there could have been other reasons, but the primary reason, it was very simple. I was focused on running for president. There would be nothing wrong if I did do it. I was running my business while I was campaigning. There was a good chance that I wouldn't have won, in which case I would have gone back into the business. And why should I lose lots of opportunities? So here's the story. Go back and look at the paper that Michael Cohen wrote before he testified in the House and/or Senate. It talked about his position. What he's trying to do, because he's a weak person and not a very smart person, what he's trying to do is end, and it's very simple. He's got himself a big prison sentence, and he's trying to get a much lesser prison sentence by making up a story. Now, here's the thing. Even if he was right, it doesn't matter, because I was allowed to do whatever I wanted during the campaign. I was running my business, a lot of different things during the campaign. So very simply, Michael Cohen is lying, and he's trying to get a reduced sentence for things that have nothing to do with me. Now, let me go a step further. I think you should go back to, I think it was January. It was just reported very well by Catherine Herridge, who's a terrific reporter on Fox. She talks about a letter that he signed. I don't even remember it. And it specifically talks about this deal. This deal was a very public deal. Everybody knows about this deal. I wasn't trying to hide anything. Okay. I cannot understand you.
Supporting groups like Hamas and Hezbollah in Syria and Palestine. So when you see Putin, what are you going to tell him about these activities?
Well, we're going to talk about it, but we have a lot of things to talk about, Jeff.
You're going into a summit shortly. What is your sense about a trade deal with China? What do you expect to say to Mr. Xi?
I think we're very close to doing something with China, but I don't know that I want to do it, because what we have right now is billions and billions of dollars coming into the United States in the form of tariffs or taxes. So I really don't know, but I will tell you that I think China wants to make a deal. I'm open to making a deal, but frankly, I like the deal we have right now.
Are you going to meet with Putin? And if so, what are you going to do?
I probably will be meeting with President Putin. We haven't terminated that meeting. I was thinking about it, but we haven't. They'd like to have it. I think it's a very good time to have the meeting. I'm getting a full report on the plane as to what happened with respect to that, and that will determine what I'm going to be doing. Well, I have a couple of reports. We're getting a finalized report. Are you talking about on the Russian situation with the ship and the Ukraine? Yeah. We're getting a finalized report. I'm going to have it on the plane sometime today.
Why aren't you meeting with the Crown Prince?
It just wasn't set up. It only wasn't set up. I mean, I would have met with him, but we didn't set that one up. I'm meeting with President Xi, which is a very important meeting, having to do with trade. And as you know, I'm making about 3 or 4 meetings. We just didn't have time.
If Cohen is, Mr. President, are you going to be raising the case of new Americans being held in China with President?
I'm going to bring it up, yes.
What about the peace process? President?
I don't hear you. You got to talk. You see that? You have a helicopter. No, the question was asked yesterday about pardons with respect to Paul Manafort, who, it's very sad what's happened to Paul, the way he's being treated. I've never seen anybody treated so poorly. But the question was asked to me by the New York Post, and I said, no, I have not offered any pardons. And I think they asked, or whatever, would you? I said, I'm not taking anything off the table. That was done as a question from the New York Post.
If Cohen is such a bum, why did you hire him, have him on your payroll for 12 years, and have him do so much of your dirty work?
Because a long time ago, he did me a favor. A long time ago, he did me a favor. No, not at all. Not at all. I'm not worried at all about him. You just take a look at his written document. Go back, take a look at what he wrote in, I think, January. He has a written statement, and that's the fact. Yeah.
There is a campaign in the city of Strasbourg who wants to push people to vote for the European election, saying, friends, we don't want the European Union to be like Trump's America. What do you want to tell them? What do you want?
I don't know what, you know, you can't with a helicopter.
Yeah, but what do you want to tell
a possible shutdown if we don't get the wall money. A very possible. We're in negotiation. If we don't get border security, possible shutdown.
All right, the President of the United States. There you see the banner, the headline from the President today as he makes his way to the G20 in Argentina. Michael Cohen is not a very smart person, that he's simply cutting a deal because he is expected to go to jail, in the President's words, for a very long time, and this is a way to get a reduced sentence. Somebody asked him, why has Michael Cohen been a part of your life for so many years if he's such a dumb person and doesn't know anything and is not a very smart person? And the President said because he did him a favor very many years ago. And of course, the question is what favor?
Yeah, Michael Cohen has actually said he's done the president many favors, and that's part of what's gotten him into some hot water legally.
So the president saying that Michael Cohen is lying. If you are a prosecutor, you're not going to cut a deal with somebody who you believe to be lying. In this one particular instance.
In this one particular instance.
Yes.
He's charged with lying to Congress. He's charged under that wonderful catch-all statute, 1001, for making a false statement. So the only person that hurts is Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen is a liar. He is pleading guilty to lying. I mean, I don't even think that is debatable. Whether or not this goes from anything beyond Michael Cohen's lies into something that actually gets opened up into an investigation that further affects Donald Trump, the Trump Organization, the Trump Foundation, we have no idea. It may be all wrapped up in this little basket. I guess I mixed my metaphors there. But it may just be all wrapped up in this charge. And if that is so, then the president doesn't have anything to be concerned about. On the other hand, if it looks like it really leads toward more questions of more witnesses and more documents about the whole idea of Russia collusion, which the president would be the first person to say is not a crime. We're talking about conspiracy, which is a crime. Well, only Robert Mueller's office and perhaps the Southern District of New York know that.
So Michael Cohen already pled guilty this summer. We've been talking about this, to campaign finance violations. So he's already facing some sort of punishment, whether it's time behind bars or not. I don't know. So to me, it begs the question: why would the Mueller investigation be interested in him at all? If it's, you know, if it's just that he's done something wrong and he should pay for it, well, that's taken care of in the Southern District. Why would they be interested if they weren't getting anything out of him?
Well, I assume that they're very, very interested in it because it really does have to do with the president's ties, if any, to Moscow, and that has always been the whole impetus behind the original investigation, which is long before Robert Mueller, might I add, that when this investigation started, it started to look into Russian activity and perhaps Russian collusion that affected the 2016 election. It was narrow, but it was broad.
That's right. You know, Caitlin, we were listening to the president make comments there to the press, and the president said, the question, it was hard to hear, the question was perhaps something along the lines of, what is this deal that Michael Cohen is pleading guilty to have lied about to Congress that you may have had with Russia? And the president said, well, you know, we were looking at a lot of deals and we didn't go through with it. But the question, of course, becomes, what is that deal? Because the president said it's all out there in a public record. It was written up, you know, in newspapers. I don't know what deal that is. And it becomes really cloudy because every time the president speaks about this, he muddies the water a little bit more. If you're just the person at home who's not following this closely the way we are, it's hard to know. Oops, there goes the water. It's hard to know what the president is being truthful about and what he's not.
And it's been an intentional strategy of this White House and the legal team to muddy those waters. Remember going back to Rudy Giuliani, one of his first television appearances as a representative of the White House legal team, or the president's legal team, really just kind of all over the place and muddying those waters here. And over the past 2 years, the president has consistently called this investigation a witch hunt, has called it a partisan attack, has packaged it to his supporters as a way that Democrats, he says, are trying to undermine the election and undermine the voters themselves. And we've seen that have an effect in public polling. We've seen Republicans increasingly in public polling, evoking similar language of the president and agreeing with him that this is a witch hunt. We've seen some changes, too, among independents. And the president, over the course of the midterm campaign, was bringing this up a lot, trying to message to his supporters that kind of they're coming to get you too. And so it has had a corrosive effect. And the president here, we've seen him do this over and over again in a couple of different ways. One is to completely dismiss this as related to anything to do with him, to call the person in question a liar and looking out for their own interest, and then completely disassociating himself in many ways from that person who had been in his orbit. This in the case of Michael Cohen, who we're looking at the aggregate of all of the people involved that we've been talking about over the past 2 years. Cohen is arguably the closest to the president, not only personally, but also closest to his finances, which, again, there is no transparency about the president's own finances.
You know, the other thing that the president keeps, and not just the president, but his lawmakers who are his supporters keep saying is, it's time to wrap this up. This has been going on far too long. And you're seeing that reflected in the polling, too, not just among Republicans, across the board. People are getting exhausted.
They are getting exhausted, and it is important to point out that, first, this is entirely legal, and it isn't as long as some of these other investigations that we've seen. But the way in which the president messages on this, consistent in his language, has had an effect on the public perception of this, which turns out in some ways to benefit him. Now, there is this question about the not only the public pressure, but also oversight now that we're going to have of the president from Democrats that Democrats feel has been lacking over the past 2 years.
All right, we've been going for an hour and 45 minutes or so. Let's pay some bills. We'll take a little break. We'll come back. We'll regroup at the top of the hour. You're watching CBS News, CBSN, always on.
Well, hi, everyone. I'm Anne-Marie Green.
I'm Vladimir. For those who are just joining us, we are following a developing situation in New York. It's actually not even developing anymore. It has happened.
Yeah.
President Trump's former lawyer has pleaded guilty to lying to Congress. Here he is, leaving the courthouse in New York City earlier today. He admitted to making false statements last year related to a plan to build a Trump Tower in Moscow.
Yeah, I mean, it's developing in the sense that what does this all mean as we move forward, right?
Yeah.
So back in August, Cohen also pleaded guilty to other federal charges. You might recall this. But those charges were involving his taxi business, bank fraud, and campaign work that he did for then candidate Trump. So President Trump spoke about his former lawyer to reporters just outside of the White House just moments ago before departing for Joint Base Andrews ahead of his trip to the G20 summit. That's in Argentina. Here's what the president had to say.
Related to us, he was given a fairly long jail sentence, and he's a weak person. And by being weak, unlike other people that you watch, he's a weak person. And what he's trying to do is get a reduced sentence. So he's lying about a project that everybody knew about. I mean, we were very open with it. We were thinking about building a building. I guess we had in a form, it was an option. I don't know what you'd call it. I decided ultimately not to do it. There would have been nothing wrong if I did do it. If I did do it, there would have been nothing wrong.
All right, so we have Ricky Kleeman with us and Caitlin Huey-Burns, both. We've been talking about this basically since it broke, and what does it all mean? First off, the details. I know a lot of people probably might be tuning in right now. So can we talk a little bit about how we got to this point? What led investigators, and this is the Mueller investigation, different than the
Southern District.
Exactly, which is he pled guilty in the Southern District in the summertime. This is the Mueller investigation charges. What got us here?
In the summertime, in August, Michael Cohen pleads guilty to basically campaign finance violations, among other things. He is supposed to be sentenced on December 12th. As soon as he pleaded guilty, he and his lawyer offered him up to the office of the special counsel. He cooperated with the special counsel and continues to cooperate with them. Meanwhile, suddenly, it comes to the attention of the special counsel's office, whether it comes through the idea that it came through press reports, which is what we are led to believe, but it could have come from anyone, a witness, a person, who someone says to one of the prosecutors, remember, it's not just Robert Mueller, but one of the prosecutors or investigators working with him, hey, wait, there's a discrepancy here. Michael Cohen has been saying one thing about the Moscow project, which had to do with real estate, and Mr. Trump, and perhaps other doings in Moscow publicly and to us and to the Congress Oversight Committee. And it turns out that these press reports lead us to believe that he really wasn't telling the truth. Mm-hmm. So they call him back in, and they work out this deal where very quietly, no leak, we were all surprised this morning, Michael Cohen walks into court in the Southern District of New York and pleads guilty to a one-count information with a capital I, which is a charging document that has 7 counts to it, which talk about his various false statements. He really can't get beyond the fact that they're false because he documented them in a 2-page letter, and his testimony was consistent with that letter. Where this plea of guilty, number one, leads Michael Cohen, does he get sentenced on December 12th for this plus the August crimes that he pleaded guilty to? Does the sentencing get postponed? And 2, where does it go next, if anywhere?
There's a lot to also unbundle, Caitlin, with regards to what we heard earlier before the president spoke, which is senators, Senator John Kennedy making statements to the press, Senator Mark Warner, who's very influential. Because, you know, one of the interesting things, we were talking about the House and the Democrats taking control of the House, but actually in the Senate, looking into the special counsel has been very bipartisan. It has been a lot more bipartisan than it has been in the House, right? And so when you've got senators saying, look, he should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, this means that our oversight is working. Does it?
Well, there also has been an interest in moving to create some kind of legislation, pass some kind of legislation to protect the Mueller probe in its entirety, because the president just a few weeks ago fired Jeff Sessions, and he has been, as of this morning, tweeting about the Russia investigation. Now, senators blocked the legislation yesterday to move forward with that. There has been some controversy about whether they think that is the best course of action here. The president has also been, for the past 2 years, muddying the waters on this whole entire conversation, and we saw him continue to do that when he was speaking to reporters on his way to depart for Argentina, where in Buenos Aires, where the G20 will be meeting. And again, there's going to be an extra spotlight now on this, because the president, as he said just a few moments ago, is going to plan to meet with Vladimir Putin. And again, that's against the backdrop of new Russian aggression in Ukraine, but also will put a bigger spotlight on what the president might say to him, either behind closed doors or publicly, and again raises questions about why the lying here. What does Cohen know? What will he say to investigators? What more is there to say? What has he already said? We don't know. But I think it's worth pointing out that that is also going to take a larger implication now. Whether or not the public is interested in this, I think it places a bigger spotlight.
So you raised such an interesting point, right? Which is the lying. And we were talking about it. All of us were astounded. How do you lie to Congress? How do you lie about, business dealings that you may have had in the case of Michael Flynn? And part of the appeal that President Trump had, because I covered a lot of the rallies before he was elected, was that he was an outsider and that the people around him were outsiders, right? But what strikes me as I read some of these documents is that the way that they operated, these people that are surrounding the president of the United States, including his son, Don Jr., if you stiff a contractor in New York City because you're building a building and then you lie about it, like in a deposition that because you're being sued, it's one thing. And maybe that's been business as usual. You pay off a porn star or two because you don't want it to leak it to the press. That's how it was done when you were a private citizen. All these individuals who are being busted because they're lying, it's because that's why it's so interesting. Jeff Sessions immediately, when he recognized that he had a conflict, there was no question. He's not going to go talk to the president about it. He knows the right thing to do is to remove himself.
Well, and you heard the president talk about this a little bit too, talking to reporters, that he still thinks that he's kind of operating on a learning curve here because he has not been in public life before, and that has seeped into the perception among many of those who support him that, well, even if this was going on, he wasn't in politics at the time. So he has really leaned on that outsider perspective, and those involved have too. But what's really interesting here is that everybody that has so far pleaded guilty in this investigation has been for lying about
exactly.
it.
We were saying that.
And in some ways, that has, gone back to the president. Of course, it begs the question of, okay, why? What are you lying about, and why? But also, the president has been able to kind of use that to kind of separate himself from all of these actors involved. You heard him just a few moments ago saying, well, Cohen is a liar and he was lying because he is facing a stiffer sentence on something else totally unrelated to me, and he's trying to get out of it. And
he's not the only liar. That's the bottom line. That's what we're figuring out. He's not the only liar. Ricky, Caitlin, thank you guys so much for being with us. This was really helpful to help us unwind it, because it sort of happened when we were on the air. We had a whole show stacked with a bunch of other news, and all of a sudden we needed help to sort of decipher what was happening right here in New York City, and you guys did that for us. So as always, we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, turning to New Jersey now, where prosecutors in Colts Neck are giving an update following last week's quadruple homicide and a fire at a mansion. Let's listen.
Well, the suspect has been in jail since we charged him last week. So by virtue of that, because he's incarcerated pending trial, he has to be cooperative. As far as the service of charges go, they occurred this morning without incident. Yes, ma'am.